In this module, we want to talk about a couple of network reference models, specifically the OSI model and the TCP/IP model. And by the way, sometimes in some literature you might see that the TCP/IP model is also referred to as the TCP/IP stack. Let's get started though with the OSI model. A fundamental concept that you need to understand to be successful in your networking career is to understand the concept of the OSI model. So many times in your career, somebody's going to say or you're going to read that a particular device or a particular piece of software or service runs at a certain layer of the OSI model. The OSI, or the Open Systems Interconnect model, is made up of 7 different layers, and you might hear somebody say that a switch belongs at layer 2 of that model. A router lives at layer 3 of that model. And by the way, it gets to be a bit of acronym soup here. The OSI model is technically the ISO OSI model. What I mean by that is the standards body, the ISO, the International Standards Organization, they developed the Open Systems Interconnect, or the OSI model. And it has 7 different layers, and we're going to be discussing each of those layers. Down at the bottom, and think of this like a building if you would, where the bottom floor, floor number 1, is on the bottom of the building and we go up from there, so the second floor is right on top of the first floor. At the bottom of the OSI stack, or the OSI model, we've got layer 1. It's called the physical layer, and we'll be talking about that in a lot more detail. But just in general, the physical layer is responsible for how we get bits, 1s and 0s, out on the network. How do we electrically or optically represent those on the network? Moving up to the data link layer, just to give you one example of something that lives at the data link layer, we have a switch, like a Cisco Catalyst Layer 2 switch. And a switch can make forwarding decisions based on physical addresses, the addresses that are burned in to the network interface cards inside of computers, network devices. And that address is called a MAC, Immediate Access Control address. That's an address that lives at the data link layer. And that was a physical address. If we move up a layer to the network layer, here we have logical addressing. We're going to be talking a lot about IP addressing, logical addressing. That's a layer 3. That's a network layer concept. Moving up to layer 4, we've got a couple of primary protocols there. Those are TCP and UDP, and we'll be contrasting those. TCP is connection oriented, while UDP is connection-less, and we'll be defining the distinction between those two. Now, the upper 3 layers, the session, the presentation, the application layers, things start to blur a little bit, to be honest, when we get up in those layers. Sometimes you might be looking at a network and say, well, this particular service or this particular application or this particular appliance, I'm not sure exactly where it maps. Maybe I'm not able to find a session layer within a particular application, and that's okay. We don't have to have something that populates every single layer. Remember, this is just a reference model. This is not a requirement that anything we put on the network has to neatly plug into one and only one layer. No, we can have something that belongs to 2 or 3 layers, or something that is missing 1 or 2 layers. That's okay. And things become a little bit more challenging to classify when we get up to these upper layers, layers 5, 6, and 7. But in general, layer 5, that's the session layer. It's responsible for setting up, maintaining, and tearing down sessions. Up at the presentation layer, we're concerned with how data is presented or formatted on the network. For example, we might encode a block of text using ASCII, or an old way of doing that was called EBCDIC. Something we can do, by the way, at the presentation layer is encryption. For security purposes, we might want to scramble up a block of text. So if somebody is sniffing, somebody is capturing packets from the network, and they intercept that traffic, they're not going to be able to do anything with it because it's all encrypted. It's all scrambled up thanks to the presentation layer. And finally, up at the top, up at the application layer, and I've got to admit, the application layer is one of the more challenging layers to really understand. The biggest challenge is the name, I think. We say application, and many people would assume that applications live at the application layer. Something like Microsoft Word, that's an application, but that does not live at the application layer. We're not talking about desktop applications when we say an application. No, instead we're talking more about services, the services that support an application. For example, if you have something like Microsoft Active Directory running in your environment, you've got that single repository for usernames and passwords, and that is made available to various services throughout the network. That's an example of something living at the application layer. It's an application, it's a service. We could advertise a service. The advertisement of services, that's considered to live at the application layer. And a goal that I have for you is for you to memorize each layer in order of the OSI model. And there are a couple of acrostics that can help us out, a couple of memory aids. We could remember the acrostic of all people seem to need data processing. That's where we're starting at the top, up at the application layer, and we're working our way down. The A in all reminds us of the A in application. The P in people reminds us of the P in presentation, and so on and so on. Again, that's all people seem to need data processing. That was top down. If we want to go from the bottom up, we could do that. We could remember the acrostic of please do not throw sausage pizza away. Please do not throw sausage pizza away. The P in please reminding us of the P at the physical layer. The D in do reminding us of the D in the data link layer. The N in not reminding us of the N in the network layer, and so on. Please do not throw sausage pizza away. And throughout my networking career, I've heard various metaphors to describe what's happening within the OSI model. I've heard the analogy of having a letter that you write up at the application layer, and you stick it in an envelope and you address it, and you stick it in another envelope and you put another address on it, things like that, and it gets encapsulated and wrapped up and wrapped up and wrapped up until it gets to the bottom of the building, and somebody takes it out of the building, they go to another building, and it starts going up the floors of that other building, and people are unwrapping the package and taking out the envelope and taking the letter out of the envelope. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that metaphor. Really, the best metaphor that I've ever heard is the metaphor of a bookshelf. Think about what a bookshelf does for you. In fact, here's a picture of a bookshelf that I have in my home, and it's somewhat organized. You can see in the lower left-hand corner, that's where I keep my books that I've written for Cisco Press. Just above that, I've got my Star Wars books, and I've got different categories on different shelves. But you might notice, there are a couple of shelves on that bookshelf that don't have any books on them, and that's okay. That goes back to the point I was making earlier. You don't have to populate every layer. If you're looking at some sort of a network application and you're thinking, I'm not sure what protocol lives at the session layer, that's okay. Maybe nothing lives at the session layer. This is a reference model, and as I read once, it's not a reverence model. We don't revere it, we just use it as a reference. And we want to dig in a little deeper into these different layers of the OSI model. Let's get started down at the bottom with the physical layer.